Keanu Reeves felt a gentle buzz of excitement backstage at the awards show. The bright lights, the quiet hum of voices, the soft rustle of dresses and tuxedos, all of it made his heart beat a little faster. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket and took a steadying breath. Tonight, he was not thinking about any movie role or stunt. Tonight was about sharing something real. He had always been a private person. He chose his words carefully, spoke softly, and kept most of his personal moments out of the spotlight. But this time, on this stage, he felt called to tell a story that few knew. A story that had touched him deeply and changed the way he saw his work and his life. The host of the show, an energetic interviewer known for friendly banter, grinned. As Keanu joined him on the brightly lit couch, the audience applauded warmly, and Keanu offered a small, grateful smile. He settled into his seat, his calm presence contrasting with the lively atmosphere. For a moment the cameras hovered on him, capturing every thoughtful blink and quiet nod. Then the host leaned forward and said, "Keanu, you've won tonight, but we know you've seen a lot on the road to success. What's one story from your career that most people don't know but should hear? Promise us it will move the whole world to tears." The audience laughed in anticipation, and Keanu's expression softened. He looked out into the sea of faces, driving home the importance of every person there. He paused, as if gathering the memory from far away. "I promise," he said quietly, "that this is something real, something that changed me forever." His voice, measured and sincere, filled the theater. He spoke of a time years earlier, long before the bright lights of fame felt so bright. He painted the scene in simple strokes: a backlot in Los Angeles, dusty roads, trailers lined up, and cables snaking across the ground. It was the day they were filming Speed, a movie that would become a hit. But on that day, the set felt ordinary, just another place to work. Keanu described Sandra Bullock walking onto the set before anyone else. She carried a small cooler bag, the kind you might take to a beach or a picnic. Inside were homemade breakfast burritos, fluffy eggs folded into warm tortillas with fresh salsa and a sprinkle of cheese. She moved from person to person, handing them out with a bright smile, to the grips who tightened cables, to the camera operators who framed each shot, even to the driver who brought the next load of props. No one was too small or too unimportant for her kindness. Keanu said his own eyes widened when he saw her approach the sound technician, who was kneeling on the ground checking microphones. She knelt beside him, offered him a burrito, and asked if he wanted coffee too. The technician's surprise turned into delight. He shook his head, laughing, and said it was the best breakfast he had ever had. The audience on the awards show leaned in as Keanu's calm story began to take shape. He spoke of the ordinary magic that Sandra created each morning, a magic born from true generosity. She never announced what she was doing. She never asked the studio to pay for it. She did it because she cared about people. Keanu described how words like star and celebrity can put people on a pedestal, making them seem distant. But he saw Sandra break down that pedestal, one burrito at a time, insisted on looking into each person's eyes, treating them like equals. Keanu said that watching her taught him something important, that respect and kindness can be as simple as sharing a meal. He remembered that day as both ordinary and unforgettable. The sun had warmed the trailers, and the smell of breakfast mixed with the scent of dust and hot metal. Keanu recalled how the chatter on set felt friendlier, how people laughed more easily, and how the mood stayed light even when the director called for another take. Everyone moved with a spring in their step because Sandra had reminded them that they mattered. Keanu said that he felt the same gentle lift in his own spirit. He had just met Sandra that morning, and already he felt connected to her in a way that went beyond co-stars. He felt part of something bigger. Community then. With a gentle breath, Keanu shifted the scene. He told how Sandra had slipped away quietly, leaving the set when the call for lunch came. No one noticed at first. She walked off with no fuss, no entourage guiding her. Keanu said he followed her curiosity, not wanting to intrude but sensing that something of heart was unfolding. He described the ride through traffic, the city passing by in a blur of glass buildings and palm trees. Sandra sat in the back seat, calm and thoughtful, as if she was heading to a close friend's house rather than an important destination. When they arrived at the children's hospital, the air felt different. Keanu talked about the clean smell of antiseptic mixed with a faint scent of flowers from the entryway, quiet hallways, painted in soft pastels, held walls adorned with drawings made by young patients. He recalled Sandra's gentle steps, her voice low as she spoke to the nurses. She introduced herself as simply Sandra, without any mention of movies or fame. The nurses led her to a small room at the end of the hallway, where a little girl lay in bed, her hair thin from treatment, but her eyes bright with hope. Sandra kneeled beside the bedside, her smile warm and genuine. Keanu watched from the doorway, his heart swelling as he saw Sandra become Mama Bullock in that moment. He described how Sandra read the girl's favorite storybook, using different voices for each character. She pointed at the pictures and asked the girl questions about the colors and shapes. When the girl grew tired, Sandra gently adjusted her blankets and held her hand. Keanu said he saw tears slip down Sandra's cheeks as she listened to the girl's soft words about her dreams of becoming a doctor one day. In that room, Sandra was not an actress. She was a friend, a protector, a source of comfort. Keanu remembered how he felt, a mix of admiration and humility. He realized that courage could be as quiet as a whisper shared between two hearts. Back on his couch, on the awards stage, Keanu's voice softened even more as he spoke of the lesson he carried with him. He said that fame can blind people too. The simple power of kindness. He told the audience that when he returned to the set the next morning, no one mentioned the hospital visit. Sandra never sought credit or applause. She simply did what she believed was right. Keanu said he wanted to honor her by sharing that act of love, showing everyone that a single, unannounced moment of care can echo across lives and lift spirits in ways no movie can. He looked at the host, then out at the audience and said, "I learned that a star is not who stands on stage, but who stands beside someone in need, without cameras or fans, and offers what they can." The audience sat in hushed silence for a moment, and then began to applaud softly at first, then with growing warmth. Keanu nodded, his voice steady, and said, "That is the story I wanted to share." He smiled, a quiet light in his eyes, knowing that a simple breakfast burrito and a few kind words had shown him the true meaning of generosity. And with that, he settled back, letting the applause wash over him, grateful that he had given voice to a moment of real heart that moved him more than any scene he had ever filmed. Keanu arrived on the speed set before sunrise. The lot was quiet then, with only a few crew members moving between trailers. You could hear the faint hum of generators and the soft clatter of metal as grips set up camera rigs. The morning air was cool, and the smell of coffee drifted from the craft table. He stepped out of his trailer, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He liked these early moments when the world felt still and he could focus on the day ahead without the rush of cameras and lights. He spotted Sandra walking toward him, carrying her familiar cooler bag. She wore a simple t-shirt and jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. Her smile was gentle, like the sun rising over the desert hills beyond the lot. Keanu called out a greeting, and she waved back. He watched as she opened the cooler and pulled out a warm, foil-wrapped breakfast burrito. You could almost taste the soft eggs and melted cheese. She offered one to him. He accepted it gratefully and took a bite. The flavors were fresh, a little salsa heat, fluffy egg, a hint of salt. It was a perfect start to the day. As they walked together toward the first camera position, Sandra handed more burritos to people working nearby. A grip with grease smudged hands caught her eye, and she paused to ask how his daughter was doing in school. He blinked in surprise and said that his daughter loved her drama class. Sandra laughed and said she hoped to catch one of her plays someday. Keanu felt warmth spread through him. He knew Sandra cared about every person on this set, no matter their title or role. By the time the director called action, most of the crew had tasted her breakfast gift. Cameras rolled, and Keanu and Sandra ran through their scene. Keanu felt the engines roar beneath their feet, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Yet even amid the rush of stunt cars and shouting voices, He could feel Sandra's calm presence beside him. Her voice rang clear through the speakers. Eyes met his for a brief moment, and he saw kindness there. It reminded him that, no matter how intense the work, he was never alone. During breaks between takes, Keanu noticed Sandra slip away again to the cooler bag. This time, she passed out bottled water with handwritten notes attached. Each note said something simpler. Thank you, good luck, stay strong. One note read, "You make a difference." Keanu held his in his hand, reading the neat handwriting. He folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He felt a small smile tug at his lips. Sandra's words lifted him more than any line of dialogue could. As the morning turned into afternoon, the set buzzed with energy. Extras in bus driver uniforms stood by in case they were needed for a crowd scene. Lighting technicians adjusted. Reflectors, shifting angles to catch the sun just right. Keanu walked through the chaos like a dancer in a well-rehearsed piece. He exchanged jokes with the stunt coordinator, who teased him about his next big jump. He laughed and said he would. Need more breakfast burritos to fuel a stunt like that? The coordinator raised an eyebrow and pointed at Sandra, who was loading more water bottles into a cart. Talk to her, he said with a grin. Keanu learned that Sandra never spoke of her own comfort. She spent every spare moment thinking of others. When the makeup chair was empty, she sat with the hairstylist and listened to stories of the stylist's family. When a production assistant dropped a stack of scripts, she knelt down to help pick them up. She joked about the stack being heavier than a championship weightlifter might lift. Everyone laughed, but they also felt seen. Keanu noticed that the mood on set remained light, even when long hours made people tired. He realized that Sandra's small gestures kept everyone going. By late afternoon, the cast and crew had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Keanu sat on a crate near the craft table, sipping coffee and flipping through the script, found himself rereading Sandra's note again, the words "you make a difference" echoing in his mind. He thought about his own journey, the long nights of rehearsal, the injuries on previous shoots, the doubts that crept into his heart when he questioned his choices. Sandra's kind act reminded him why he did this work. He wanted to inspire people, to make them feel something real. He wanted to show respect to every person he met. As the crew prepared for a high-tension stunt, the director called for quiet. The sound of a bus hurtling down the set echoed in everyone's ears. Anna and Sandra climbed inside, their faces set in determined silence. Keanu glanced at her and saw steel in her eyes, but also compassion. It struck him that she cared deeply about this story of speed, but cared even more about the people telling it. In that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude for her partnership. Not just as a fellow actor, but as a human who brought light into every corner of a dusty backlot. After the take, the director shouted, "Cut." Keanu and Sandra high-fived, their breath clouding in the cooler air. The crew cheered, and Sandra began passing out burritos again, this time to the stunt drivers. Keanu watched as she crouched beside one of the drivers, asking him how he learned to handle such powerful vehicles. He heard the driver say that his father taught him when he was a boy. Sandra listened with wide eyes and said she wished she had a father who taught her to drive. The driver laughed and said he could give her tips sometime. Sandra agreed, grinning. By the end of the day, the sun had dipped low, and long shadows stretched across the lot. The pace slowed. Sets were struck down, cables coiled, and trailers packed up. Keanu and Sandra walked back toward their trailers, carrying empty water, bottles, and wrappers. They fell into an easy conversation about plans for the evening. Sandra said she wanted to visit a friend's art exhibit. Keanu said he hoped to catch a quiet dinner. They said goodnight, their smiles soft in the fading light. Back in his trailer, Keanu sat down and thought about the day. He felt tired, but happy. He thought about the laughter he had shared, the notes he had read, and the breakfast burritos that had become symbols of something much bigger. He realized that kindness was a force stronger than any explosion or crash. He thought about the crew members he barely knew, whose faces he would recognize anywhere, and who now held a special place in his heart because Sandra had shown them they mattered. Keanu stood and walked to the mirror. He looked at his reflection and saw eyes that had witnessed genuine care. He unwrapped the final burrito Sandra had given him and took a slow bite. He closed his eyes and let the taste remind him of the day. He whispered softly, "Thank you," not to Sandra, but to the idea of kindness itself, the simple power to lift spirits, to unite people, and to make a set feel like a family. He lay down on his trailer bed, the burrito sitting on the nightstand. His thoughts drifted to hopes for the next day on set. He imagined more scenes filled with action, more lines to learn, more shadows to chase in front of the camera. Yet above all, he looked forward to seeing Sandra step onto the lot with that cooler bag, ready to share breakfast and uplift every soul she met. He fell asleep with the hum of the lot in his ears and a gentle smile on his face. Already dreaming of the kindness that tomorrow would bring, Keanu woke before dawn with a quiet knot of worry in his stomach. He had sensed something different in Sandra's eyes the day before, a depth that went beyond kindness on set. After the morning scenes and the ritual of breakfast burritos, she had slipped away once, and then again. This time he felt he had to follow. He moved quietly through the trailers until he found her, slipping past security into a waiting car. He climbed in beside her without a word. Sandra glanced at him with soft surprise, but did not ask him to leave. In the dim light of early morning, Keanu saw that her face held determination mixed with tenderness. The drive to the hospital felt long and winding. The city slept, and streetlights cast pools of yellow on empty roads. Sandra tucked her cooler bag in her lap and stared out the window, as if she were thinking of someone she missed. Keanu watched her in the rearview mirror. He remembered how she had handed burritos to grips and boom operators with equal warmth. Now he realized there was more behind her generosity, a purpose that drove her beyond the film set. He waited for her to speak, but she remained silent, hands resting gently on the bag, as if protecting something precious. When they reached the children's hospital, the front doors slid open with a soft whoosh. A nurse at the desk greeted them by name and waved them through without questions. Keanu followed, his heart beating faster. The nurse led them down quiet corridors painted in gentle pastels. Cheerful drawings lined the walls, smiling suns, rainbows, animals playing in fields. Keanu thought of how frightened these children must feel, and he tightened his grip on the strap of his backpack. He knew this was new territory for him, far from explosions and stunts. They arrived at a small room at the end of the hall. Through the glass window, Keanu saw a little girl lying in bed. Her hair was thin, and her skin looked pale. Despite that, her eyes were bright as she stared at a stuffed bear clutched to her chest. Sandra paused at the door and smiled so gently that Keanu felt a wave of warmth wash over him. He realized this moment was bigger than any scene in Speed. It was about real courage, both the girls and Sandra. Single quotes. Sandra entered the room and closed the door behind her. She knelt beside the bed, set down the cooler bag, and carefully opened it. Inside were small wrapped packages, coloring pencils, sticker sheets, and a soft blanket embroidered with stars. Keanu felt a lump in his throat as Sandra lifted a package and handed it to the girl. The girl's eyes widened. She whispered, "You brought my favorite stickers." Sandra smiled and said, "I remembered." She then took out a storybook and began to read, her voice soft and clear. Amu leaned against the wall outside, listening to her gentle tones. He thought of how many times his own heart had raced on set, and he felt it slow now, soothed by this quiet gift. Inside the room, Sandra read of magical forests and brave heroes. She paused to ask the girl questions about the pictures. The girl pointed and giggled softly when Sandra made a silly voice for a dragon. Nurses stood just outside, wiping tears from their eyes as they watched. Keanu peeked through the crack in the door and saw the girl's lips move in time with the story. Sandra laid the blanket gently over the girl's legs, smoothing it until it felt like a warm hug. The little girl touched Sandra's hand and said, "Thank you for being here." Sandra's eyes glistened. She said, "I needed to be here. I wanted you to know someone cares." Keanu stepped inside then, quietly closing the door. Sandra looked at him, her eyes still soft. The nurse stepped forward and whispered that the girl's condition had worsened, and she had asked all morning. For Sandra, the nurse said she had no idea Sandra was coming. Sandra nodded and bent down to kiss the girl's forehead. "I promise," she said, "to come back tomorrow." The girl smiled and drifted into a gentle sleep. Sandra stood, her shoulders steady, but her eyes shining. Keanu felt his throat tighten as he watched her protect that child's small world. They left the room together in the hallway. Sandra thanked the nurses and whispered a few words of encouragement. Keanu followed, feeling as if he walked on hallowed ground. Outside, the sun was rising, a thin ribbon of orange light across the sky. Sandra paused and closed her eyes, breathing in the fresh air. Keanu stood beside her, offering quiet support. She opened her eyes and said, "I needed to do that." She reminded me why kindness matters more than applause. Keanu nodded, knowing he could not fully describe what he had seen. He felt stunned by how one person's act of love could shine brighter than any movie premiere. On the drive back to the set, Sandra was thoughtful but calm. She spoke quietly about the girl's bravery, about how the child had smiled. Even when she felt pain, Keanu listened, feeling honored to hear the details. He thought of how many times he worried about box office numbers or critics' reviews. Now, those concerns seemed small compared to a child's need for hope. He realized that real stories, the ones that moved people to tears, were not told in scripts. They were lived in hospital rooms, in whispered promises, in moments of unguarded compassion. Back on the lot, the crew was setting up for the next shot. Cameras stood ready, lights gleamed, and people moved with purpose. Sandra rose from her chair and walked to the cooler bag, handing out burritos to anyone nearby. Keanu watched as she knelt beside a sound technician, asked about his wife's recovery from surgery, and laughed at his joke about hospital visits. The technician's face lit up with gratitude. Keanu walked over and handed him a bottle of water with a small note taped to it. He had quickly scribbled, "Stay strong, you matter." The technician read the note, looked at Keanu, and gave him a thumbs up. Keanu felt a tug in his heart. He knew that day was not about acting. It was about being human. He walked through the set, passing out burritos and notes himself. Each person he greeted brightened at the gesture. It reminded him of how Sandra had taught him to notice others, to acknowledge their struggles and their strengths. He thought of the little girl in the hospital, dreaming of better days. He thought of how Sandra had knelt to meet her gaze, treating her with respect and love. As the sun climbed higher, the director called for action. Keanu and Sandra moved into position inside the bus. Engines roared, cameras rolled, and they performed the scene with energy and focus. Yet beneath the rush of adrenaline, Keanu felt something new, a sense of connection. He shared a silent look with Sandra as the stunt unfolded. They both smiled against the wind. Keanu knew that together they held something more precious than a perfect take. They held the power to lift spirits, to kindle hope, and to remind everyone that behind every role, behind every story told on screen, there were real people whose lives mattered beyond fame. When the director finally called cut, the crew cheered. Louder than any explosion sound effect, Sandra climbed down, smiling, and Keanu followed. He wrapped an arm around her shoulder and said quietly, "Thank you for letting me see." Sandra leaned into him and replied, "Thank you for coming with me." They stood together as the crew gathered for a group photo, each person holding a burrito and a note. In that moment, Keanu felt the ripples of their journey beyond the set. He knew the world would never be the same for him, or for anyone who learned the story of the hospital room and the little girl who found comfort in a stranger's gentle heart. Keanu woke with the sun's first light filtering through his trailer window. He sat up slowly, feeling the weight of yesterday's secret journey hovering in his mind. The memory of the little girl's smile, of Sandra's gentle voice reading stories, and of the quiet hospital room stayed with him like a warm ember. He dressed in his speed costume and stepped out onto the lot, taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. He watched as grips rolled cables, as lights were raised, and as the set began to stir. Yet nobody spoke of the hospital visit. Sandra moved among the crew with her usual calm smile. The day began exactly like any other. Keanu found himself looking for the cooler bag before breakfast. When he saw Sandra kneeling by the craft table, unpacking burritos for the set, he felt a small surge of gratitude. She caught his eye and nodded as if to say, "Today is just another day." He walked over and took a burrito without fanfare. The warm food tasted comforting, but more than that it reminded him of kindness lived rather than shown. He chewed, thoughtfully thinking of the girl's favorite stickers and the soft blanket Sandra had brought. No cameras had recorded that moment, no press had announced it. It had simply happened. As cameras rolled for the first scene, Keanu carried the memory of that quiet act with him. Every time he climbed into the bus prop or exchanged lines with Sandra, he felt a spark inside, an echo of something more meaningful than a box office hit. When the director called cut, he surprised himself by stepping toward a sound technician he hardly knew. He handed him one of Sandra's leftover notes, a small scrap of paper that said, "You bring magic." The technician looked at him in surprise, then smiled broadly. Keanu nodded and whispered, "You do?" He felt his own heart lift in return. During lunch, the cast gathered under a canopy of trailers. The hum of conversations mingled with the hiss of propane heaters. Keanu sidled up to Sandra and took a seat beside her. She was unpacking water bottles with little notes taped on. He watched as she handed one to a camera assistant and asked about her weekend plans. The assistant beamed, saying she was visiting family in Orange County. Sandra told her to send regards from the set. Keanu felt proud to sit next to someone whose kindness extended even to strangers. In the afternoon's long wait for a complicated stunt, Keanu found himself alone near the edge of the lot, watching the city skyline shimmer in the heat haze. He thought of how easy it would be to keep fame and fortune at the center of his thoughts. He could have spent hours worrying about how his performance would be received. Instead, his mind returned to the hospital hallway, to the pastel walls, and the soft hush of machines. He smelled the antiseptic again, heard the girl's weak but hopeful voice. He realized that those minutes with Sandra had changed his purpose. He did not just want to entertain. He wanted to serve. When the cameras rolled again, Keanu carried that new purpose into every take. He greeted each crew member with genuine warmth. He asked the stunt driver how he felt about the upcoming shot. He offered to share a burrito with the makeup artist. He laughed with the extras waiting in their uniformed bus lines. And all the while, he remembered Sandra's lesson, that the greatest generosity comes without spectators. At the end of the day's shoot, Keanu and Sandra gathered the final burritos and water bottles. They walked toward their trailers together, side by side in comfortable silence. Keanu said softly, "Thank you for showing me how to live kindness." Sandra looked at him with a gentle expression and replied, "Thank you for seeing it." They shared a quiet smile before heading off to change. That evening, Keanu was invited to a charity gala for the Children's Hospital. The organizers, having heard a rumor of a special visit from a film star, asked him to speak about the hospital's work. Keanu agreed, thinking this was a chance to honor the little girl he had met. On stage, in front of donors and patients, he spoke not of ticket sales or his latest role, but of a shy girl who loved sticker sheets and bedtime stories. He described how a simple act, reading a book, handing over a blanket, could break walls of fear and fill a room with light. His voice was calm and sincere. Tears glistened on the faces in the audience. After his speech, a young mother approached him, clutching her sleeping child. She told him that her son had been in the same ward and that his spirits had lifted. When he heard laughter through the door, she said he asked her every day if a movie star would visit him too. Keanu knelt to her level, placed a hand on her shoulder, and promised to come back. He felt the promise settle in his chest like a vow days later. Back on the talk show set where he first told his story, the host asked him how the hospital visit had changed him. Keanu paused, remembering the pastel walls and the little girls. Soft words. "It made me see," he said, "that fame is not what you have, but what you give. Every role I play on screen is a story, but the story we live, that story is kindness, and it moves people more deeply than any film ever could." The audience sat in quiet awe before erupting into heartfelt applause. In the weeks that followed, Keanu invited Sandra to join him on another hospital visit. This time, the child he met was not the same girl, but a little boy who clung to a superhero action figure. Sandra knelt beside him, handed him burritos and a coloring book, and asked about his favorite hero. Together, they created a new moment of gentle courage. Keanu watched Sandra lean in close and saw her eyes light up with the same warmth he had seen before. He leaned down too, offering stickers and soft words. Walking back through the hospital corridors, Sandra reached for Keanu's hand and squeezed it. He squeezed back, thankful for their shared journey. He knew the world would remember Speed, but he cared more about the story they wrote behind the cameras. He cared about the ripple of hope that spread each time someone chose to be kind. That evening, as Keanu prepared for sleep, he thought of how a single secret act unrecorded, unannounced, could shape his life and inspire countless others. He knew that Sandra had taught him a powerful lesson, that true generosity requires no audience. It exists in the quiet moments of connection, in the simple gift of attention, in the gentle sharing of one's heart. He drifted off to sleep with gratitude filling his dreams, ready to move the world again one kind act at a time. News of Keanu's story spread quickly. People shared clips of his interview online, quoting his words about kindness and hidden acts of love. Fans wrote about how they felt moved to help someone in secret, to do small deeds that made a big difference. Keanu watched these messages with quiet joy. He read tweets from a bus driver in Chicago who handed out free rides to seniors because he remembered Sandra's burritos. He saw a post from a school teacher in Sydney who read extra stories at bedtime. To comfort a troubled child? He smiled, knowing the ripples of one moment were growing across the world. Meanwhile, charity groups reported an increase in donations. Children's Hospital in London received more children's books than ever before. Volunteers signed up to read to children in hospitals, nursing homes, and shelters. A community center in Mumbai organized a kindness day, where neighbors cooked meals for each other. Keanu heard these reports on the news and felt a gentle pride. He did not seek praise, but he was glad that a simple story could inspire. So many acts of kindness. On the set of his new film, Keanu noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Crew members greeted each other warmly. They shared snacks, helped carry heavy equipment, and spoke with genuine interest in each other's lives. Keanu remembered how Sandra had started it all with a cooler bag on Speed. He joined in, bringing fresh fruit and juice to the craft table. He handed a bunch of bananas to the lighting crew and asked how their families were. They laughed and said they would invite him to their next barbecue. He grinned, knowing that kindness felt good to give and receive. Sandra watched him with a soft smile. She met him in the morning and quietly handed him a note that read, "Keep the fire burning." Keanu nodded, tucking the note into his pocket. He felt that their shared secret had become a gift to others. He thanked Sandra later, saying he could not have done it without her example. She replied, "We all have the power to move hearts. I'm glad you saw it." They stood in the soft light of dawn, two friends bound by a shared belief in simple kindness. Keanu received an invitation to speak at another event. It's time for a global film festival. The festival organizers asked him to talk about his work and his views on fame. When he took the stage, he began by thanking the audience for their support of his films. Then he paused. He looked over the crowd, thousands of people from different countries, all with a love for cinema. I said, "I want to share a different story today." Told them again about Sandra's secret visit to the hospital, about the little girl who loved stickers, and about the lesson he learned, that the smallest acts, done without cameras, can move the world. The crowd was silent. Then they stood and applauded, not for his movies, but for the idea that kindness mattered above all else. Keanu felt tears prick his eyes as he looked at faces in the audience. He thought of parents, children, workers, and volunteers, people who understood that a kind heart can change a life. He finished by saying, "When we all carry kindness in our pockets, the world becomes a better place." The applause that followed was loud and long. After the talk, people came up to Keanu in the hallways. A filmmaker from Brazil told him that she had started a hospital reading program because of his story. A student from Canada said he and his friends had formed a club to help elderly neighbors with grocery shopping. A nurse from South Africa said she cried when she heard his words, and that it reminded her why she chose to care for others. Keanu listened to each person, his heart full, shook hands, hugged some, and promised to keep sharing the message. Back home, Keanu found a small box on his doorstep. Inside were letters from children he had never met. They drew pictures of superheroes sharing breakfast, of people reading books in hospitals, of hearts floating in the sky. One girl wrote, "Thank you for being kind like Sandra." Another boy wrote, "I want to grow up and help people too." Keanu read each letter with care. He placed them in a folder to keep safe. He thought these children were the real heroes, the ones who understood how small actions could ripple outward. On a quiet evening, Sandra and Keanu met at a local park. They walked along a tree-lined path as lanterns glowed overhead. They talked about how the world had changed in small ways since that day on the speed set. They laughed, remembering the grease-smudged grip who thought the burritos were a gift from the craft table, not a star. They smiled at the memory of their first hospital visit, how Sandra knelt beside the child, and how Keanu felt his own heart open. They both felt grateful for that unexpected journey. Sandra reached into her bag and pulled out 2 burritos wrapped in foil. She handed one to Keanu. He took a bite, tasting the same flavors that had started it all. Said, "Every time I taste these, I remember why I'm here." Sandra nodded and said, "And why we must keep giving." They sat on a bench, eating in comfortable silence. Fireflies danced around them, and the night air was cool. They watched each other with quiet affection, knowing they had shared something rare and true. The next morning, Keanu went to a local community center to help serve breakfast. He stood behind the table handing out plates of eggs, toast, and fruit. People lined up, smiling to see him. He greeted each person by name when he could, and he asked them how their day was going. Some were surprised to see a movie star in an apron. Keanu laughed and said, "Food brings people together." He felt at home there, among neighbors helping neighbors. Later that week, Keanu received an award from a children's charity. They commended him for raising awareness about the power of hidden kindness. He accepted the award on behalf of Sandra, saying she lit the spark. He spoke of the hospital room, of the child who found comfort in a story, and of how that moment had taught him the true meaning of generosity. The audience stood, cheering not just for him, but for the idea that anyone could be a hero through a simple act at night. Keanu often found himself thinking back on those early days of filming Speed. He remembered the roar of engines, the lines to learn, and the scenes that would later appear on screen. But he held most dear the memory of Sandra, the cooler bag, and the children's hospital. He realized that no stunt, no special effect, no red carpet could ever match the impact of a quiet act done with a full heart. As the years passed, Keanu continued to share his story whenever he could. In interviews, he spoke about kindness. Social media posts, he challenged fans to carry out a secret act of service. He even started a small foundation to support hospital reading programs. The foundation remained low-key, focused on real help rather than publicity. Yet it touched many lives, funding books, blankets, and storytelling sessions for children in need. Sandra occasionally joined him for these visits. They remained friends, bound by their shared belief in kindness. They laughed together as they passed out burritos to helpers, hugged nurses, and wiped away tears from grateful families. They never sought cameras or headlines. They simply showed up, listened, and offered what they had. One day, a journalist asked Keanu what he hoped people would remember most about his career. He paused, thinking of the blockbuster films, the magazine covers, and the awards. Then he said, "I hope they remember that kindness matters more than fame. That behind every role, behind every story on screen, there's the chance to make a real difference. And that sometimes the smallest moments move the world to tears and to hope." And in that simple truth, he found the deepest meaning of his work and of life itself.